Herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, zurück.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon here to our Franco-German Energy Forum. I'm very glad to have you here with us. And this morning was already very interesting. We had good discussions. My name is Jan Rugner. I'm a science journalist, and I am at the Technical University of Munich, and I will moderate this conference. The first panel this afternoon is entitled Hydrogen and Mobility. We will be talking about theoretical considerations and practical examples. And I am very glad. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Wiebke Zimmer to you. She's Deputy Director of the think tank Agora Verkehrswende, which would be transition in transport, and she will be talking about the importance of hydrogen for carbon-free mobility, opportunities, limits, and perspectives. Please, Mrs. Zimmer, you have the floor. Yes, Mrs. Rubik, thank you very much for the floor and for the invitation to talk to you from our perspective about hydrogen for carbon-free mobility. Firstly, I would like to make a small introduction. Why are we still talking about this topic, carbon emissions in transport? You can see here the emissions in greenhouse gases in Germany, and you can see that since 1990, the level has been more or less the same. So the emissions have not gone back. In 2020, you can see a small dip, and that is, of course, because of Corona, the pandemic, and now we're climbing again back to 1 million tons per year. And the dark blue line you can see is the German Climate Action Act, which in Germany, at least at the moment, has set certain targets of emission reductions down to 2030 for certain sectors. That would be 48% for transport by 2030. And we have seen emissions hardly being reduced last year, and we have also not reached our targets last year or the year before. So in transport, this sector, we have a huge challenge. We only have 6.5 years left, and we have to halve emissions. Now, I would like to briefly talk about the end energy consumption, which, of course, at the moment still correlates with emissions. On the left-hand side, you can see this greenish segment of the circle. 30% of the final energy needs are covered, the emissions are emitted by the transport sector, and right to the right, you can see a circle. 94% is petroleum, diesel, kerosene, liquid fuels. So we need to have a different mobility pattern. We need a transition in mobility and in energy. And here you can see different scenarios. So we have different options. We here compare efficiency of different kinds of fuels, where we've tried to translate this and illustrate it in conversion. You have the battery electric vehicle at the top, then you have the fuel cell vehicle in the middle, and below you will find the internal combustion engine vehicle, which is then used with electricity-based fuels. And you can differentiate here between having energy right down to from the well to tank, and then to the right you have the energy consumption of the vehicle. And the losses right down to the tank with electrical vehicles, battery electric vehicles, with the fewest losses. You can see the efficiency here in the middle, where you can see 95% efficiency. So if we have wind turbine with 10,000 megawatt hours, then you have 9,500 left at the tank. And second would be the fuel cell vehicle. Here we have hydrogen using electrolysis. You can see that. So we have an efficiency of around 64%. And the least efficient are the synthetic combustion fuels, because we have electrolysis plus more losses during the procedure towards having synthetic fuels. So we have 64%, 73%, and in the end, only 47% left arriving actually at the tank in e-fuels from the electricity amount which has been used. And if you look at these efficiencies and think that it will be more efficient in the future, then those are the vehicles which you can see in light blue here. Then at the end of the day, you still have this relationship in energy efficiency between electrically driven vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and internal combustion engine vehicles with e-fuels would be in such a way that it has to be read that you will see that a fuel cell vehicle will need so much more electricity than a battery propelled vehicle. So with e-fuels, we actually have to put a lot in to get very little out of it. And here I'd like to give you 3 sentences just briefly to the heavy load vehicles, because you will hear more about this from Dr. Koenig later. Here we have TCO of battery electric trucks, rather conventional trucks, electric trucks, fuel cells for diesel, and so on. And then you can see here, fuel cells, we have only 0.2%, so you can hardly see them. But what I did want to show you with this foil is that even when using fossil diesel, the battery electric heavy load trucks will prevail over the next years, and they will have a positive TCO, which is to be expected. And if you could use e-fuels there, then of course the cost side, it would be more expensive. Now we have a lot of dynamics when developing battery electric trucks. There we have fuel cells in trucks, which will still be used for special applications, but I think Mr. Koenig will be telling you more about that later. Just briefly on e-fuels and how they are produced. E-fuels is a collective terms for fuels which are produced from H2 and CO2, and you can see the E, of course, stands for electricity, so it's electrical manufacturing, electrical production of hydrogen. And if you have renewable electricity, then we have sustainable e-fuels. So by using electrolysis, you will have the so-called green hydrogen. And if the carbon dioxide is then also extracted in a sustainable manner from the atmosphere, then it is as a whole sustainable. And to the left below, you can see that we need huge amounts of water for producing e-fuels, about 10 kilograms or 1 kilogram hydrogen when using electrolysis. And if you have carbon dioxide and hydrogen, then you can combine them in this fuel synthesis. And what is important to me is that because we have limited production capacities, and we heard about this morning, that there is also competition, because hydrogen is also needed in the industry. And then you have energy efficiency and costs, where you would say you have the e-fuels and hard to basic to abate sectors. So these are sectors where at the moment we don't really have any alternatives. And therefore, in the transport sector, we mean basically aviation and shipping. Now, to shipping, on shipping. Here we have the planned production volumes for e-methanol. And you can see that if everything goes right, then we will have methanol production capacities as planned at the moment. Then we would reach by 2027 about 3 million tons of e-methanol globally available. And then we have this lilac, which is the largest share, which all stems from one announced big project in the US. And if that does not work, then we would globally have much less e-methanol. And to the right, you can see the dark column where we have the EU demand by 2034. We have calculated the amount of fuels we need in the shipping sector at the moment, so it's a conservative estimate. And beyond that, we have the 2% quota according to the Fuel EU Maritime Regulation. And we will see the globally available amounts or produced amounts. They will be sufficient for the EU, but at the end of the day, we do need renewable fuels for shipping because globally speaking, really, it's not enough. Now, if we go to global e-kerosene production volumes to the left, we see the share in the final energy consumption in aviation. And aviation has been regulated by the e-fuel aviation regulation, prescribing 1.2 by 2030 and 2% by 2032. Then in lilac, in purple, you will see the absolute amount for Germany in demand. So it's a little more than 100,000 tons annually for the years 2020 to 30, and then 200,000 tons in 2032. At the moment, we have some very small demonstration plants for e-fuels with the drop synthesis being used in Germany at the moment. And then we had larger installations which have been planned, but we can see that even, well, the amount we need in Germany is actually nearly identical to European expected production. So we massively need to ramp up e-fuels for aviation as quickly as possible so that we will have the necessary capacities for production. In Germany, it's actually being discussed whether or not to use e-fuels in road transport. And we have these limitations for carbon dioxide emissions for lightweight vehicles or cars. And we saw that in the EU as well. So we were wondering and thinking how much space we would need for the necessary solar energy plants. To the left, you can see solar energy capacity, which would be necessary in photovoltaics in the EU for aviation and shipping. And then compared, we put it in here so that you get a feeling for what it means. Let's say Chile is very popular for the production of e-fuels, and if we wanted to cover the whole needs in the EU for shipping and aviation in photovoltaic capacity, and if we produce it all in Chile, then this dark blue Atacama region in South America would be necessary. And if we then additionally wanted to cover road transport and decarbonize it using e-fuels, then we would need to need the whole Atacama region, which would have to be filled with solar panels just for to cover EU demand. I wouldn't want to go into this here very much, but it's very clear that it will not be enough to produce e-fuels in Germany for shipping and aviation. So it's very important to have sustainability criteria which apply globally. We need to introduce these criteria, and I'd like to now get down to my summary. So our recommendations or the results would be that e-fuels for the foreseeable future will be indispensable for climate action in aviation and maritime transport, also in parts of the chemical industry. And policymakers should now focus on ramping up the markets for e-fuels through appropriate regulatory frameworks and also to support research and development. And as soon as the political framework has been set, it will be up to the industry and the financial sector to expand the supply of e-fuels for essential applications as quickly as possible. In Germany, we very much talk about investment in the development of global e-fuel production for road transport, but we do have hardly foreseeable risks, and it may not pay off. Investments may rapidly lose value, and global production of e-fuels will have to be socially and environmentally equitable. And therefore, we need comprehensive sustainability criteria so that we can also protect those countries where possibly we will be producing e-fuels. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mrs. Zimmer, for this presentation. And you spoke very clearly about shipping and aviation and partly also the chemical industry. Now, what about market ramping up of the market? And I'm talking about the chat now. I found a question here, and I can only invite you all to put your questions in the chat. So you were talking about ramping up the market for aviation, and you said that, of course, there you will need the right framework conditions. Could you tell us exactly what kind of steps you would like to see? What would be helpful? How could we ramp up this market? That's a good question. The point is that with the EU quota 1.2 and 2%, we now already have set some framework conditions. So we have a market for e-kerosene, and it has been secured. And what we now need is investment in the facilities. And I think that is already happening. I think we already have the grant, I think, for Leipzig with the e-kerosene plant. Because the point is that investment in production facilities are very expensive, and they will pay off over the years, and only if the framework conditions are right, so that you can be assured to be able to sell the e-kerosene. And another question, and this is also about forecasts, mobility forecasts, because that's always a highly political topic. So when talking about transport policy and the forecasts behind that, the question is, what do you think? What about mobility in the future? Do you believe that having more trains running or fewer cars, personal private cars, have you already put that into your modeling? One thing is sure, if we want to reach our climate targets, which is something I really do hope for, then it will not be sufficient to change the technology we're using, we will also have to change our mobility patterns. So electrical vehicles, if we have 100% renewables, they will be completely carbon-free, but we still have a problem. We don't have unlimited renewables, and we don't have enough raw materials for the batteries and electrical engines. So we certainly need to see a change in our mobility patterns, which does not mean that we have to reduce mobility. It means that we have to change, let's say use the bicycle, trains, even buses more. So we're not talking about being less mobile, but just differently and nevertheless comfortably. Thank you very much, Mrs. Zimmer, for this presentation and your explanations. And we bid you goodbye, at least from the panel here. And I would like to now introduce the next speaker.
Mr. Mougenot is the National Director of Regional Transport at SNCF, the French train company. So a warm welcome to you, sir. I imagine we'll see you in a moment. We can see the title of the presentation already. Hydrogen for the decarbonisation of rail transport in France. A warm welcome to you, Mr. Mougenot. We seem to have a problem with the camera. I hope that we'll at least be able to hear Mr. Mougenot clearly. Are you there? Can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. My camera's not working, but I can hear you. Well, we can't see you, but we can more or less hear you. Camera's not on. So there we go. So we can hear you reasonably well. So can I get going? Can I start? Yes, away you go. Thank you. Well, I'm sorry. I just haven't managed to work out how to get my camera going, but I'm going to start with the presentation nonetheless. I'm delighted to talk to you today about what SNCF is doing, and also my particular department, the regional transport. So first of all, on the next slide, you can see the way in which the SNCF group is organized. And that's actually changed quite recently on the 1st of January 2020. New legislation came into force. We've opened up to competition, which is something that you already know all about. In German trains, SNCF is organized into 5 different firms. There's the network, there's links abroad as well. We have Keolis, which works in the urban realm. We have also Geodis, which is a freight company, 3 billion turnover and 275,000 staff, and we're in 125 different countries. So that's all I have to say presenting the group. But you can also see that within that there is regional transport, TER, express regional trains. I'll talk to you about that. So we focus on the fast trains, the TGV trains, and the intercity trains. And we also have Transilien. Those trains are just in the Paris and Ile-de-France region. So those are local regional trains, whereas these TER trains are express regional trains. And they run in the 11 administrative regions. They're not in the Ile-de-France, which I just mentioned, because there's the Transilien regional trains that work. And of course, in Corsica, we don't have a train network either. I don't need to read the slide to you, but let me tell you something interesting. 1.2 million passengers per day. And we also have a really pronounced increase in number of passengers since 2002. We have a 60% increase in passengers, particularly since the COVID era. We've seen that compared with 2019, there's been an increase in passenger levels of 20%, which is a very striking figure. And they're divided mainly between the long distance routes and also in the Paris region, so from the center of towns to the periphery. So it's really multimodal approaches are something that you very much see in the minds of the French. We need to respond to this kind of situation. We have to work in conjunction with the mobility organization authorities in the regions. We've only had 2 years to respond to this pronounced increase in the number of passengers. So a few words on the SNCF Group's environmental goals. Here you can see that we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We want to decarbonize our sector as part of our corporate social responsibility strategy, which of course has an environmental dimension as well. Around 10 or so years ago, we set ourselves the goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 30% in the transport sector by 2030 and cutting them by 50% in our real estate park. That's quite significant for us. Now, I deal with these TER trains, the regional express trains. Passengers in France have recognized that we are one of the modes of transport that have the best carbon footprint, so we're part of the ecological transition. The train is relatively low carbon. There is still a degree of greenhouse gas emissions. We need to reduce that, certainly, but SNCF has done all it can to cut direct emissions. For example, energy consumption has been reduced. That's for electricity, for traction, and also for locomotives, for example, and train sets, but there's also part of our fleet, although it's small, they still have fossil fueled engines. So that's something that's very important. So we seek to make energy savings. And we've made a 10% reduction in TER in the use of energy. There are special tools to assist with driving the vehicles to ensure that less energy is used. We also look at the amount of time that our locomotives are simply standing. Of course, it takes a while to get the air conditioning going and to get the vehicles up and running, but we have nonetheless managed to get a 10% reduction just by changing our operational behavior. And by 2050, we want to reduce to zero the amount of train sets that are still run on fossil fuels. That's very important. And we're working on this in conjunction with the regions, with these mobility organization authorities. They're the ones who provide the funding for our work, certainly for quite a lot of what is happening with the regional express trains. So here you can see the backdrop to the current situation. We're working on decarbonization of the entire sector. That goes for the train stations, it's also for energy consumption. What we try to do is, for example, to reuse braking energy. We diversify the kinds of energy that we use as well, focusing in particular on renewables, of course. Hydroelectricity, solar power, and wind energy. We also have a sector called SNCF Renewables, and they have solar power stations on land that belongs to us, that is not really being used for anything. It's also some of the car parks, for example, in the station car park at Aix-en-Provence, for example, we have photovoltaic units being set up by 2030, and that will account for the equivalent of 20% of our consumption per annum. So that is a particularly promising approach moving forward. Now, as to decarbonisation of our actual rolling stock and our fleet, we can move on, if you like, to the next slide, and you'll see some of the options. We work in some cases with fossil fueled vehicles. 25% is the relevant figure there for the TER sector. So TER of the over 8,000 cars that, and vehicles rather, trains that are out circulating every single day. So we're looking at this in conjunction with those who produce the rolling stock, the regions, as I said. There are 11 regions. We have Occitanie, Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes, the Grand Est region, just to cite a few. So we work together with them on our rolling stock, and we're looking at various specific decarbonisation projects. We're moving to biofuels. That's a bridging solution for us, and biofuels are developing well and at speed. There's one experiment underway. In Paris, Normandy, that works quite well, but the real focal point of our work is on decarbonisation of the rolling stock per se. So we have hybrid TERs. We call them that to reflect what happens with cars. So you've got batteries there, plus fuel, if possible, a biofuel, but certainly fuel plus batteries, so hybrids. We also have battery-operated trains, replacing the traditional engines with batteries. And then there's something that we're looking at today, of course. We're also working on prototypes for hydrogen trains. So you can see the timeline at the bottom of the page. So you see we've ordered prototypes. We've got the first battery-operated ones that'll be up and running next year, certainly for trials. We've got initial tests for hydrogen trains, and we have trains that are becoming operational from 2024 for battery trains and beyond 2026 for hydrogen trains. That means that the low carbon fleet will only really be up and running in a few years' time after 2030, certainly, but we're working particularly on biofuels in this transitional period, with biofuels as a bridging solution. Moving on now, let's take a look at the reasons why we're also looking at hydrogen as a solution. As I said, we're working on various different options, but hydrogen is one that is significant for us. That's because it aims to work within the context of the network that we already have, and we have long-distance trains and have to find a solution for that. So over 300 kilometers is a distance where we think that hydrogen becomes interesting as an option. So how do we work nowadays? What we're doing at present is looking at this with the regions and train manufacturers. We're developing a prototype. We want to look at the technical performance to see if you have the right kind of range, what level of consumption there is, what kind of wear and tear there is. And we want to see whether the hydrogen approach actually makes economic sense. I imagine this is part of all of your programs as well. The cost of hydrogen remains rather high, 3 to 6 times higher than the cost of diesel. So we need assistance, we need extra funding to switch to hydrogen. Production of different kinds of hydrogen is, of course, interesting. We can have a quite feasible approach in France to the low carbon electricity being used to produce low carbon hydrogen. We can work with solar and wind power and also draw on nuclear power stations within France. So we're trying it out to see how its technical performance does. And what we're doing is rather specific. We don't want to work with a 100% hydrogen train. We've got hybrid trains, so it's an electric train. It's got a traditional catenary system, plus it's also at the same time hydrogen powered. And that means that hydrogen reserves can be preserved when operating on the catenary. And that means that it's possible to have a good combination. We need to try out the system to see how well it works. Of course, this has provided a basis for us to advise the regions, specifically the mobility organization authorities, as to the best use cases. And we'll be looking specifically at which lines and which routes are best suited to working with this after we have the prototypes tested and moved to actual operation in 2026. In order to ensure that this really works, we need to get to grips with the technology. We need to make sure that it's safe, that we have good security provisions. It is a brand new format, of course. We're used to working with electricity. We're used to working with diesel. Hydrogen is brand new. That means we're paying a great deal of attention to making sure that everything is safe and secure. We also need to get to grips with the question of supply. Each of the regions involved is looking into their own production sites and supply approaches. It all needs to be up and running if we're to work with hydrogen to become competitive. And something else I mentioned earlier as well, production of hydrogen needs to become cheaper. Costs need to go down. There is funding that's being made available to bridge the gap, but that, of course, will be a temporary approach, and the costs are currently too high. And then there's a question of how we're going to deploy hydrogen trains. We've got 4 regions that are involved: Auvergne, Rhône, Alpes, Bourgogne-Franche-Comté, Grand Est, and Occitanie. And as I was just saying, the validation tests will run from 2024 to 2026. The first commercial operation of these train sets will be from 2026. With around 250 passengers at 160 kilometers per hour. That's equivalent to a total of 231 million euro projects. 215 million thereof was provided by those 4 regions that I just cited. We're working with regions as our partners. We've got a great deal of work ahead of us. It's an ambitious program. However, we are very committed to it. And I hope to see you again in the future at another forum to be able to give you an update on how we're doing on implementation. I hope I didn't talk for too long, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jean-Aimé Mougenot, for that interesting insight into the hybridization and hydrogen technology for trains. We have one question from the chat that we've got time for, but please answer briefly. Could you perhaps give us some specific examples from France about how certain corridors for trains can't be electrified? And following that, where do hybrid train sets make particular sense?
It's fairly straightforward. Of course, we have some routes which aren't electrified. It's 25% of the total. So these are low frequentation. That means that we don't have many trains and we don't have many passengers. And of course, the overall traffic is shooting up, but it's 25% totally. And the cost of electrification, we don't have all the figures at my fingertips, but the cost of electrification is not at all the same order of magnitude as the cost of having a hybridization approach or retrofitting the rolling stock to get a hydrogen engine on board. So the costs are attractive when it comes to developing hydrogen. It's much more attractive actually than setting up a whole new catenary system. And I've forgotten the second part of the question. Yes, the question was about whether a hybrid approach is the best approach. Why are you going for hybridization? Well, yes, hybridization. That's right. Well, we're intermeshed with electrified track and track that currently isn't electrified. That's where we're going for this hybrid approach. That means that we won't have rolling stock that is too dedicated to particular tracks. That would, of course, increase cost. It will make it easier to get operations up and running. That's why we're going for a hybrid approach. And that also means that we can do better. For example, when you're in a large station, like Lyon, for example, you can go from the Massif Central via Clermont-Ferrand. Part of that route is electrified, but part of the route isn't electrified, and you can get all the way to Lyon, which is a really big city, and then you can switch to the catenary system. And basically being able to switch between the two means you've got a much broader range. It's much better than just working with a hydrogen engine. And it means that we wouldn't need to have too many charging stations, at least initially. So it's to really make the operations smoother.
Thank you very much for giving us that glimpse. And we're going to carry on in the transport sector with Dr. Jan Krönig, who is head of strategy at Daimler Trucks and Buses. And he's going to be talking about hydrogen in the decarbonisation of road freight transport, taking Daimler Truck as his example. Yes, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be part of this Franco-German Energy Forum today, talking about the potential of hydrogen for decarbonising road transport in Europe. But before I talk to you about our initial successes with hydrogen trucks, let me say something briefly about the challenges we face. Can we see the next chart? I think one point, and this is a pretty impressive figure I wanted to share with you, is that trucks, Daimler Trucks, we have 9 trillion ton-miles of transport globally per year at the moment. So we're not talking about a single load here. Whether we're talking about solar roofs or fuel cells, we want them delivered to our shops and to our front doors, and hence this mileage. Another reality is that 2 billion tons of CO2 are combusted each year in the process, and that's why we want to decarbonize. And we want to be a leader in the industry. So we adopted a vision to play a leading role in this sustainable transportation, in driving this decarbonization for road transport forward. And how are we going to do that? Here we see a 3-phase view. There is the technical view. On the right-hand side, we see the infrastructure view, and in the middle, we have our customers. One thing we think is important is that the 3 points need to be attuned to one another if we're going to be successful. Why? Well, partly, and this is pretty obvious, and we share the responsibility for this, we need to ensure that the vehicles, the trucks you see at the bottom, in this case it's an Actros, we need to provide propulsion which is, or can be, carbon-free, which means we can either go down the road of battery electric, or we can go down the road of hydrogen-based fuel cells. These are ways of keeping the truck completely carbon-free. But you can see on the right-hand side, we need the infrastructure to do that. Now, we know this with cars. If we don't have charging points, we have to bear in mind the grid, the production of green energy, so that at the charging point where the truck needs the power, the energy is actually available, or hydrogen, of course. And here, I'll be showing you later, we need production capacities of green hydrogen from various parts of the globe. It's a bit like the sun and the wind, which need to be brought into Europe so they can be distributed to the points where they're needed. And all of this only works, only comes together if that fuel is available at a price that is competitive, like diesel. And our customers are familiar with this. Total cost of ownership needs to remain comparable to what they are today. And hence, range is also important. The truck needs to have similar properties, similar functionality compared with what they have today in order to meet the requirements. And all these 3 points need to interlock if we're going to decarbonize our industry. At Daimler Trucks, and we're going to show you some examples over the next few months for all 3, how we're going to go about this. So on the next chart, we can see the technical view. These are our products. What can we offer and what have we been doing? Here you can see, and above all, these are third generation variations. This is our third generation portfolio, from the decanter for light distribution, which we've been offering since 2017. And I can say that we really are a pioneer here with our e-canter. And this has a completely new propulsion solution. We call it Green Lease, because we can provide not only the vehicle, but access to the charging points and so forth. With the buses as well, since 2017, Isikara, we weren't the first here. There was a Chinese competitor beat us here to the post. But in this segment, this is where electrification is going to happen fastest. And we have a very competitive product there. And cities, I'm sorry, I'm going to mention a German city here, Wiesbaden, where we can offer the entire package to the city so that they can operate these buses. And probably the most outstanding example of electrification, which you might have heard about in the last couple of weeks, is the Mercedes-Benz Actros 600 launched yesterday, which we will be producing, the first truck with a range of 1,000 kilometers, which in long haul will indeed enable us to offer many routes without reloading. And if the driver needs to rest, then okay, no problem. But next to that, we have the Generation 2, a fuel cell-based truck. We ran it on a record run a couple of weeks ago from the pilot site to Berlin. Everyone knows that that's not an easy A to B route. You have to go, in our case, via Bremen. But we're doing quite well. We're well positioned. The technologies are coming in. And so we have second generation vehicles here that we can continue to optimize and must optimize. But basically, we have a portfolio taking shape here. So why do we believe, as a truck industry and at Daimler Truck, that we need more than a simple propulsion technology? We don't just need a battery. Because our customers are interested in range. They must be able to deal with heavy loads. And this is pretty suitable stuff for hydrogen, because we'll see this later. With 80 kilograms of hydrogen, our trucks can cover more than 1,000 kilometers. So these long ranges are possible with a light load, a light energy load. I don't need tons of battery on board, which means I can optimize my payload. So this is the segment, the know-how segment, where the vehicles are running at almost 100% capacity most of the time, and we believe that hydrogen is the right fuel for that. On the other hand, of course, these vehicles have similar characteristics, but we can see this in domestic distribution and for day-to-day delivery or on-day delivery, that battery vehicles also function because their 300, 400 kilometers are appropriate ranges that we can cater for, and our customers need those. That's what they use our trucks for. If we look at the next picture, let me briefly say something about our Gen H2 truck. Ultimately, it runs on a fuel cell, 300 kilowatt power, plus the battery for peak load, which can provide up to 400 kilowatts additionally, which means, and we've tried this, we can take on quite challenging trips here. And if you want to know the exact figure, it was 1,047 kilometers that we ran the truck on the other week. So we know that we can cover the range our customers need. So that's flexible freight, assets that run for a long time and can be run around the clock on multiple shifts. We're planning production in the second half of this decade, so certainly before 2030. On the next picture, if you remember what I just showed you at the beginning, we have to consider the operating costs. And what's our view on that? In the middle, you see ICE, that's internal combustion engines, and zero-emission vehicles, that's ZEV. We took a closer look at the figures, and as you can see, the current situation. At the moment, it's driven very much by the expensive components, above all, batteries. We can see this in the vehicle, that's the vehicle symbol here, that the vehicle per se can be run either by a battery or a hydrogen fuel cell, but it's still going to be slightly more expensive than a combustion engine. If we evaluate this at today's prices and ask which vehicle is better, we can see that diesel, for today's operational purposes, today's tolls, is still the more competitive vehicle, or it has lower operation costs for many customers. Still, that's why we need to understand how prices are going to evolve for different energies, for diesel, for hydrogen. And if prices for diesel continue to rise, and we also have to bear in mind tolls and congestion charges, whatever other costs on top, that contributes. But at the same time, we can see with green energy and green hydrogen, the potential that the costs will fall over time, which means that a time will come, not just yet, but soon, whereby a zero-emission vehicle will be cheaper to run than a diesel vehicle. The only point, and no one can tell you the answer to this, is when will that point in time be? The only thing we can see is that the influencing factors, whether they're CO2 pricing based or whether they relate to tolls, or whether we're talking more about the falling in cost of power and infrastructure on the other side, eventually that convergence will happen. How do we think that hydrogen can ever become competitive? There's a lot happening on this chart, but the point behind it is that the production of hydrogen needs to be at scale. Now, we know if we want hydrogen, a bit of hydrogen at home, a few kilograms, then probably we did this in chemistry lessons at school. I might be able to produce it for myself and use it. But when we talk about it as a truck industry, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons that we're going to need eventually. And then, just as we already have, we need a stable supply chain. And that means we have to think about different scenarios and pipelines. Which would be the cheapest? Where is green energy going to be most available and best value for money? Usually it'll come from a region where the wind blows and the sun shines, happens at different times of day. It's great if they can compensate for each other, and where electrolyzers can be run around the clock to liquefy the hydrogen that can then be taken by sea vessels to ports in Europe. You'll be familiar with those. And then from there transported to hydrogen fueling stations. That model would fulfill our need for liquid form of hydrogen for our trucks, which would enhance the efficiency, operating efficiency of our trucks in many respects. There are other ways of doing this. We can look at gaseous forms, for example, but then if you want to transport hydrogen as in a gaseous form, you need about 7 times as much capacity compared with a liquid supply. And you can imagine that that increases not only the costs, but also the inefficiency of these chains. So that's why we would tend to favor a liquid supply chain, or at least partially liquid, because we believe that this can be done at competitive prices and achieve competitive prices in the long run. So the next chart shows us why we believe that we need this infrastructure. What would happen? We've tried to simulate it if all the trucks that we want to produce in 2030 were to be only electric. Let's say we only do electric batteries. What would happen? We calculated how many charging points we need, what the energy requirement is. We looked at some examples and thought who's going to need to charge where and when. And what comes out of all that, especially if we looked at the speed at which these networks will expand, and we look at the potential with the medium and high voltage grid, it's unlikely that we will achieve that magnitude by that point in time. The next point is, if I look at how an electrical infrastructure scales up, and everyone who drives an electric car knows that today. How do you do that? You can have a wall box in my garage, similar with trucks, but if I want 22 kilowatts and not 11, I need a permit, and then all my neighbors will want the same, and then the city will need to start developing its medium voltage grid, and that means more investment. And we can see from that example, I know it sounds very trivial, I'll confess that the more charging points I have, the more increments we have in our need for investment. There's an incremental rise there. But with hydrogen, it's the other way round. The big investments are in the electrolyzers and the liquefaction plant in order to produce hydrogen at scale. But for distribution, we have basically the same model as we have with the current charging stations. That can be scaled. I can fill 1 tank, 5 tanks, 10 tanks, but I don't need so many charging points per vehicle because the charging procedure is much faster, and that makes it easier to scale up. If I compare those 2 points, ultimately, I see if I have 2 infrastructures, one for long haul, which is oriented towards hydrogen distribution, and one for more local hauls that are based on electric batteries, this will generate the lowest infrastructural costs for the economy as a whole, and also will be faster because the expansion of the charging points and the grid within Europe is a very challenging business. So what are we doing? On the next chart, you'll see that we are working in partnerships, both on the batteries and on the hydrogen pathway. I think a lot of people have understood this, but we know that as Daimler Trucks, we're not going to be able to solve this on our own. So we began at a very early point, looking actively for partners. In fuel cell technology, for example, there's Volvo Trucks, Cellcentric, to produce fuel cells. We work together with them. For the hydrogen refueling infrastructure, we've been developing partnerships where we're trying out different business models. We have one with the oil majors, but also we've been working with community organizations such as Green Lane in the United States, H2 Mobility or Accelerate, and technology partnerships as well for liquid hydrogen refueling, for example. On the battery side, similarly, we have partnerships for technology with Sattel and Manz, and for charging, Milence in Europe, Green Lane in the United States, and in different partnerships with ENGIE, Siemens, Power Electronics, but also partnerships that are looking ahead at future technologies, for example, with on the engines together with gearing. Those are e-motors, and with Ola. I'm almost finished, but thanks for drawing my attention to it. Just one to wind up. I hope you've gained some kind of impression. There's one point, and I think this would be my conclusion. Decarbonizing transport is going to be a huge challenge for all of us, and we can only do this with partnerships or an overarching European approach. I hope this has helped to stimulate your understanding for hydrogen in e-vehicles. I'm looking forward to questions. Yes, thank you, Jan Koenig. That was very interesting, but unfortunately, and I'm sure there would be a lot of questions, but sadly, we have to move straight on because we have two members of parliament waiting in the wings here, and they don't have a lot of time in their diaries, and they can't stay with us beyond 3:30. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to say goodbye to you at this point, but thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm sure your company is happy to receive emails from people who have questions. Thank you very much. Then I'm delighted to introduce two gentlemen here, Frédéric Petit, who's an MP for MODEM in the French National Assembly, and Andreas Jung, who's a member of the German Bundestag and the climate and energy spokesperson for the CSU group in the Bundestag. And both of them work in the working group of the Franco-German Parliamentary Assembly. That's the European Energy Sovereignty Working Group. Of course, it's about hydrogen and about the work of that working group. Let me simply ask you to tell us about your working group and, in your dialogue, talk about the future of hydrogen.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm audible. I don't see Andreas anywhere either. Do you see Mr. Jung? Do you see me? I see you, but I don't see Mr. Jung at the moment. But never mind, he is there. He is there. Oh, there he is. I see him now. Andreas, so shall I start? Good afternoon to everybody. Hello, Andreas. Thank you for inviting me to come along. I'm also elected in Germany as much as I represent French citizens who live in Germany and to Alia, so I'm very aware of European issues as well. Excuse me, Mr. Petit, just one moment. Your sound is not great. You're virtually inaudible. In fact, could you perhaps speak louder or something? Well, so I'll talk faster as well. So we organize a working group as part of the Franco-German Parliamentary Assembly. It's been working for 8 or 9 months on the Franco-German and European side of things when it comes to energy. There was some friction and tensions initially, but I have to say we are managing to listen to one another and to make headway. And perhaps I can hand over to Andreas so that he can fill us in and tell us what he thinks about the work that we're doing. But I just wanted to say that the topic that I think is the most germane at present and the most interesting as well is the following. I think it will actually prove to be very promising. Infrastructure is of the essence. Infrastructure offers us enormous scope to reorganize Europe on the energy front for both gas and electricity. Let me hand over to Andreas, though.
Thank you very much, Mesdames, Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to take up on that because this is something very singular in this working group, that we have two parliaments working together. We have 15 Germans and 15 French MPs working together. So it's a cross-border cooperation between countries and parties. And we are especially in charge of energy issues, and we have hearings, and then we draw conclusions from these. So what's it all about? In Europe, we had the European Community for Steel and Coal. That's how we began once, and the ECSC. And in the last decades, we haven't made enough progress, but now we need to. We have an energy crisis. We have climate change, our targets there. We want to combat climate change. We want to reach our targets. And we need a European energy union and a European hydrogen union. We are convinced that Germany and France will be the leaders here. We do have differences, but we have to overcome these differences and find synergies. That's what it's about, which is why we make suggestions for a common strategy. Federico already talked about it. Firstly, infrastructure. We need a European infrastructure, and Franco-German cooperation is so important here because we need to answer the question as to how the hydrogen pipeline will lead from Barcelona to Marseille, and in which steps will it be continued towards Germany and the European grid. We're not happy with the progress made so far. I have to be clear about this. We had the Ministerial Council in January, and an announcement was made that there would be a intergovernmental working group, and they were to give us some results by April. Now it's October, and we've seen nothing, and we have heard nothing about the discussions. This must improve. We had hoped for this intergovernmental consultations in Hamburg, and again, we have no tangible results, so we need to make progress. That was my first point. Secondly, we need a common strategy, which means that we need to have different energy strategies which will continue to exist in Germany and in France, and we have to accept them rather than trying to teach each other lessons. So we will have to accept this and then, starting from there, find synergies. So that's the precondition. And then we have to work better on a common import. We have the German import strategy, H2 Global, and we need to have the same idea as we had with Corona on COVID. We need a common strategy as we had for the vaccines. And thirdly, we also want to make sure that we develop cross-border hydrogen regions. We have Saarland, Lotharingia, and different areas, and we need to support this to make sure that France and Germany contribute. Thank you very much. We thank both of you. Now, how come are you so optimistic that Germany and France can be a drive or an engine towards an energy union? Well, optimism at the moment is actually quite limited because we can see that our governments are blocking each other rather than helping each other along. And we're talking about the design of the electricity market. Mr. Scholz and Mr. Macron said, yes, we need to make headway. Yes, we need solutions. But we are also responsible for this because we have to live up to our engagement. If Germany and France can work together, then we have helped Europe get along. There are some intermittencies, unfortunately. We will also need to have Poland on board. So we will need others, but if we can't manage to get together, then we will not see a European strategy, which is why we are damned to success. We have to engage in this, we as MPs, but also the governments. Mr. Petit?
Yes, well, I think we're optimistic because we have fora where we can debate. So this is a format where we really work together. It's a cross-party group, as a matter of fact. And when you take your time, these discussions open up perspectives that we hadn't previously grasped. It helps us make headway. I'm not going to go through exactly what Andreas has just said, but for example, there's something we're currently looking at. That's the industrial basis. So what I'm trying to say is that if we want to have a hydrogen network and develop infrastructure upstream of that, we have to develop an industrial basis, for example, to manufacture transformers for the electrical grid, to produce pumps, to produce pipes for pipelines. So the industrial basis, the manufacturing basis, is very important. There's huge investments to be made in infrastructure. And that investment needs to be in Europe. And when you put the question like that, as in the past with the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Company, raises all kinds of things that become established and promote cooperation. We don't just have to take a look and say, well, look, tell you what, you've got nuclear and you haven't, and we haven't. But they say, well, no matter what happens, we'll need to develop a whole host of different things together. For us, and our children will, of course, realize that we had to do it together. It'll be obvious to them. And if we switch to hydrogen, for example, and we purchase photovoltaic cells from China, we won't entirely resolve the problem. We also need to have the infrastructure here as well, the manufacturing infrastructure as well. There's networks, there's hydrogen strategies and so on, grids, as Andreas said. The other point that he raised as well. So what I'm trying to say is that we can be optimistic because although we have different points of view, we understand each other.
How can companies or how the industry, how far are they your allies? Because they will, of course, be responsible for production, for the infrastructure, but on the other hand, they're also customers. So they're also important on the demand side when talking about green hydrogen. So how can you cooperate with the industry?
We listen to firms. We have hearings with them. And of course, strategically, what's really important is Europe is standards. People say there's too many rules and regulations and standards, but for this kind of thing, it's very important. We need to define what is a European product. To what extent is it a green product? What makes it a green product? And for example, systems such as CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, will have a system that will be up and running for the next 30 years in Germany and in France.
And from the hearings we had, I'd like to say that the industry and the companies are expecting progress to be made. Hydrogen is a key towards climate neutrality, which is why they have a great interest. So the politicians will have to set the course, the framework conditions, and we describe this. That means that the companies will have to have the possibility of using carbon dioxide and other hydrogen colors. So we need all the rainbow colors of hydrogen, and they should be able to use them. But on the other hand, we also need reliable framework conditions for extending the grid. And this has to be taken on, and we need companies investing here. And these companies will need to have a business model. And we must manage this in our individual countries, but also at a European level. This will be interlinked. We've also had great progress in the cross-border regions. And if you see the Saarland and Lorraine, then that is a very good example of a region using synergies. Yes, but we probably need more of these projects, right?
Yes, of course, we need more of them. But what's interesting, of course, is the projects underway between Saar and Lorraine. That's replacing what used to be the Carlin basis in Lorraine. It's a large-scale project. It can save a real industrial cluster. And that's the way that Europe has always been constructed: one project, two projects, three projects, one after another, step by step. And once you get one up and running, the rest will come.
Well, thank you very much. Well, Saarland and Lorraine, I'd also like to talk about the future process of Fessenheim. We have this Aachen agreement under which we have projects, and we have said that we want to begin a new process for future-proof technologies, especially in the area of hydrogen. It will be important to implement such an initiative. They will have to be lighthouse projects, but then they will also have to be rolled out. And then step by step, we can make progress. If we have production strategies, okay, we also have import strategies. And there we would like to have a common European approach based on national approaches. Hydrogen is a scarce good, and many other states and countries in the world are also foraging on these markets. So we should appear there as Europeans, but to be able to do this, we need a common strategy, a joint strategy, and we have to make the right steps towards it. Thank you very much for giving us this insight in your working group. Of course, we wish you all the success, good progress, and we are looking forward to hear about the progress next year. Thank you very much, Andreas Jung and Frédéric Petit. Goodbye and have a nice day. Well, ladies and gentlemen, then we are having a coffee break next, but please stay tuned. Don't move away too far from your screens, because we will then have our last panel this afternoon on climate protection, economic growth, applications, the significance of hydrogen for the development of Europe. So it's going to be very interesting. Please be back at 4 p.m.